mathematics. Mathematics is probably one of the areas where that the Muslim contribution to modern mathematics is most acknowledged. Now, anyone wearing an analog watch, if you've ever wondered why it has 12 hours rather than 10, and why we have 60 seconds rather than 100, that's because it's sexadecimal counting, and that's something we inherited from the ancient Babylonians. That's why we have 360 degrees in a circle. And that was one of the counting systems that was being used at the time of the advent of Islam. I mentioned that ancient Roman Empire. I'm sure you all learned your Roman numerals in school with V for 5 and I for 1 and X for 10, which is great for addition and subtraction, and multiplication and division, a little bit harder. Higher math, pretty much impossible. Am I right, Mary Jo? Is that true? That is the head of our math department from AIS. And so that's notational counting. But the kind of counting that came out of ancient India is called decimal counting, base 10, which we're familiar with. And so these are what are called Brahmi numerals right up here. And if any of you know Chinese, you'll notice that these look a lot like the Chinese 1, 2, 3. These spread west, and they also spread east, influencing counting systems throughout the world. And so here you have the Brahmi numerals. That's about the 1st century AD. And then these are Hindu numerals in about the 5th century AD. If you notice something different between these, there's only 9 of them. And by the 5th century, Hindus have come up with the concept of 0. And that concept of 0 plus that decimal system gets transmitted to Arabia, and from Arabia throughout the Islamic Empire. And it outcompetes the other counting systems. It outcompetes the Roman numeral system and the sexadecimal system and some of the others. And it becomes the dominant counting system in the Muslim world. And eventually, the Europeans catch on. In fact, Fibonacci, who is famous for his Fibonacci sequence, he's an Italian, he goes across to North Africa and he notices how much more efficient the counting houses and the accountants in North Africa are than the ones back in Italy. And so he writes a book about this new kind of math and brings it back, and it takes off in the banking system in Europe. So you have Eastern Arabic numerals, Western Arabic numerals, and then Byzantine numerals, and notice how they're getting closer and closer. Notice how some of them, they change direction. There's the 3 looking kind of like our 3, then it changes that way, and then it gets this way, and eventually we get to the modern 3. We often call them Arabic numerals, but more properly they're called Hindu Arabic numerals. So if you've ever taken a 2-place number and stacked it over another 2-place number and put a line under it and either added or subtracted or multiplied, someone had to invent that. And the person who invented that was a mathematician named Al-Uqlidisi as a way of adding, subtracting, and multiplying. So you're doing something that was invented by a medieval Arabic mathematician. And then this is probably the most famous of all Arab mathematicians, Muhammad al-Musa al-Khwarizmi. And his name in the Latin translation of his most famous book was Logarithmy, and a portion of the title of that book was Al-Jabr. And if any of you have suffered through algebra in school, you'll know that that comes from this Arabic word. And if you've ever tried to learn your logarithms, it's thanks to his name. Art, my favorite subject. I've already talked about calligraphy and its importance in Islam. Geometry. All of those discoveries in math got Muslims very interested in geometry. The arabesque, the showing of the natural world through decorative versions of plant life also became one of the ways that Muslims like to decorate spaces. And one of the nice things about all 3 of these is that they're infinitely repeatable. So you can cover any space, and they're squashable and stretchable. So you can move them around just about any 3-dimensional space. And I've already mentioned zoomorphic calligraphy. And I mentioned briefly pictorial representation. As I said, that in sacred spaces, pretty much forbidden, but in secular spaces, very, very common. And so you get a great tradition of Muslim books, secular books, Persian miniatures, Turkish miniatures, Indian miniatures, with really brilliant figurative illustrations, some of which are really incomparable. So this calligraphy and geometry and the arabesque get put on textiles, and they get put on glass, and they get put on metalwork, and they get put on beautiful architectural gems like the Alhambra. And this is my version of the court of one of the interior courts of the Court of the Lions. And here you have, down here you have geometry, and here you have calligraphy, and here you have the arabesque all together. I visited this recently, and it didn't look anything like this because there were about 5 billion tourists in there. So, part 2. So we're going to move forward here. Architecture. That was so you could have your break and your coffee and all that stuff. So the Grand Mosque in Damascus. As Islam spread into what had been the Roman world, they encountered this, which was the rounded arch. So the Romans came up with the dome and the drum and the column, some of which they'd inherited from previous civilizations, but use that. If you look at Roman architecture, they have dome buildings and they have columns and they have arches. What's the point of an arch? Well, if you have a big wall and you want to punch a window in it, you can do what we do over here, which is a lintel, which just basically takes all the weight of what's coming down and holding it with a mass. Whoops, sorry. Okay, I just get too excited with this pointer. Okay. Okay, so that lintel up there takes the mass of the wall. But the nice thing about a dome is, an arch, is that all this weight here gets pushed to the side like that. Okay, and it goes down, so it gets pushed out and down. Well, one of the disadvantages of that is you can only make walls so high. But this is an Assyrian invention called the pointed arch. You can barely see the point here, but that's on the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And then you can also see it here on the Ibn Tulun Mosque, here. My thumb is too big, that's the problem with this. Where the points are more obvious, and you can see it here on the Taj Mahal. And the nice thing about a pointed arch is that it takes the weight more down than out. And so you can get higher and higher and higher. And Muslims also came up with other kinds of architectural forms like the horseshoe arch and the ogee arch and the multifoil arch. And this pointed arch here gets transmitted from the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem to the Ibn Tulun Mosque in Cairo, across North Africa, jumps to Italy, finds its way up to France, till eventually at what's considered the first Gothic building on earth, the Cathedral of Saint-Denis in Paris, you have pointed arches. And Christopher Wren, one of the great architects of the Neo-Gothic period, in his writing about architecture, he says at several points that Gothic architecture is the architecture of the Saracens, which was one of the European words for Muslims. And he uses rounded arches and pointed arches and something that looks an awful lot like a minaret in his building of Tim's Tower in Oxford. Astronomy, which you've already seen, but I'll... this is the astrolabe, which is the GPS device of its day. So we have the World Wide Web, we have email, we have GPS. The medieval world was a lot like our world. So the astrolabe is a Greek invention. Astrolabe is a compound Arab-Greek word. And if you had one of these, you could figure out where you were in the world. And so a civilization that knows where they are has advantages over all the others who don't. And so with this astrolabe, this was a map of the stars in the sky. And so if you knew where you were latitudinally, oh, I'm in Cairo, so I'll put in the Cairo plate on the back of this.